Okay, the way this is going to work is we're going to take notes just like you would in class. So as I'm talking over these slides, you should have your notebook out taking notes, and at the end, part of the assignment for e-learning day is to take a picture of your notes and submit them so I know that you watched this. So we're going to pick up where we left off on our notes. Um, on the Civil War, Lincoln had just been elected, and some southern states, starting with South Carolina, seceded from the Union. And so this map shows us where we left off, which states left the Union, and when they left. So we see South Carolina here with a 1, and most of the Deep South. We talked about the Battle of Fort Sumter being the first battle of the war. And so all of these are border states. And so these ones in orange were border states that still joined the Confederacy after Fort Sumter. And these states like Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, West Virginia breaks off, are slave states that still remained with the Union. So this map is important for understanding what the two sides were. And I'll use the words Union for the North and Confederacy for the South. Because, for example, Missouri makes it a little complicated. So going into the war, the North and South had some clear advantages and disadvantages. So we'll begin with the North. So some of this is a little bit of review from what we talked about with the Industrial Revolution. The North has a larger population, just sheer larger number of people. And because they were more industrialized, we saw that they had more railroads. They also have more factories for production. So when this war breaks out, the North is going to be better equipped to conduct this war and to build war materials. Some of their weaknesses or disadvantages is that the North underestimated how long the war was going to take. They thought it would just last a couple of months. And their military was not as prepared as it should have been. Lincoln, the President of the United States, goes through a handful of generals that fail one after the other until about halfway through the war. And so the Union is known for having um, poor leadership. On the South, or the Confederacy, you might recognize that painting of that guy right there. That's Robert E. Lee, and he sort of epitomizes how the South had better generals. He was the head of the main Confederate Army in Virginia, but there's a long list of very famous Confederate generals that would fall under this category as well. The South also had stronger morale, so if you think about it, they're the ones rebelling. And so they just have a little more, I guess you could say, motivation and maybe something more to fight for, at least in their minds, they do. Militarily, they also have an advantage because they don't have to invade anything in order to win. The Union, Lincoln's army, has to invade the South. All the South has to do is play defense. So as long as they can hold out the northern attacks, wait for the North to give up, the South will win. Some of their major disadvantages, one is financial. They had a much weaker economy because it wasn't as industrialized. And by the end of the war, there's massive inflation in the South, and their money is basically worthless. So don't worry about that link. That just gives you some specifics on North versus South. So this is how the two sides, I should say, look at the start of the war. You have the Union in blue, the Confederacy in sort of off-white there, all the way in the deep South, and then what way some of the border states went. For example, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland are all slave states that still remained loyal to the Union. So what we have here is, I'm not going to get too detailed with the battles. I'm going to give you kind of an overview. And as we get into the Civil War research after Thanksgiving, you're going to have a chance, if you are into battles and that's interesting to you, you can choose that as one of your topics to research. So I just want to give you a big picture of what's happening in the first 2 years of the war here. So we notice the very first battle of the war, Fort Sumter, right here off the coast of South Carolina. Then you notice two main theaters of battle. Along the Mississippi River here, that is because the Union, which is in blue, you'll usually see them in blue, was trying to They called this the Anaconda Plan. They were trying to sort of strangle the Southern economy, basically block off all their ports, and that's what you see this blue line along the coast for. And then they were also trying to split the Confederacy in two by taking control of the Mississippi River. So you see some battles along there. The other thing you see happening is up here, you see Washington, D.C., and you see Richmond. So the capital of the United States, the capital of the Confederate States. They're not that far apart. And so you can see why a lot of the battles take place in between there. To summarize what's going on up here is the North tries to take over Richmond very early in the war. This is through General McClellan coming down the coast. He fails at that. And Lee, this is when he starts to gain his reputation, pulls off a series of underdog battles, even makes it all the way up into Maryland, into Northern Territory at the Battle of Antietam. That was sort of a draw, but seen more as a Union victory because Lee retreats back into Virginia. So long story short, the war is taking a lot longer than people realize, and the South is much more formidable than people realize. So I want to talk big picture about the purpose of the war. This is the most important part. So early on in the war, as soldiers are fighting, and even if you ask the leadership, if you ask someone from the North why they were fighting, they would say to preserve the Union. They saw this as a constitutional issue, kind of what we've been talking about. Are we a united people or a collection of states? And the North believes we are a united people. We have to keep this Union together, and we're going to fight to keep it together. The Southerners maybe would have said the same thing, that they're fighting for states' rights and that they're only fighting because Lincoln sent an army into their state. But Lincoln takes this a step further, and by the second year of the war starts to think more about this issue of slavery. And he sees the war as a chance to end slavery. But if he does this, he's going to totally shift the meaning of the war from a war about states' rights and union to a deeper moral issue about slavery. So he waits for a Union victory at Antietam, a year into the war, to issue this, a very famous document known as the Emancipation Proclamation. It's a little more complicated than people think. It did free slaves, but it did it in a complicated way. First of all, it only freed slaves in rebel territory, so states that had left the Union. On top of that, it goes a step further, and in the North, it allowed free blacks to serve in the Union Army. They were still in their own separate units, and a lot of the white soldiers were still against this. But from Lincoln's point of view, he understands the morality of this, but it's also a military move. He's the commander in chief, and he's trying to win the war, and he sees this as an issue, a decision that he wants to make to help the Union win the war. What makes this even more complicated is since he did this on his own without the approval of Congress, it is strictly a military decision. And so once the war's over, it's very likely a lot of the slaves that were freed in rebel territory could be put back into slavery. So this is a temporary decision by the president, only as long as the war lasts. So this is just a map of how the Emancipation Proclamation plays out. You see it targets most of the southern states. Even down here, like in New Orleans, the Union had taken this over by that time, and so no slaves were freed there. That was exempted because the Union controlled that. And you see the states that were not affected, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, all slave states that were part of the Union. They were not rebel states. So no slaves in Missouri were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. But big picture, why this is important is it changes the meaning of the war from a Union soldier fighting to keep the country together. Now that Union soldier is fighting to end slavery. And it makes the war on a much deeper level and a much moral level, much more moral level. So I want to point out just a couple battles in the middle to second part of the war. Up here, we're going to talk about Gettysburg. It is by 1863, Lee makes a second push into Northern Territory, And you've maybe heard of the Battle of Gettysburg. It's actually all the way up in Pennsylvania. That's how far Lee was able to make it into Northern Territory. If he wins that, he could sweep down and take over Washington, D.C. It would be very likely. So the Union has to win this. It was a 3-day battle in the summer of 1863, and it is a massive Union victory. It's seen as the turning point of the war for the Union. What I'm more concerned about is what happens after Gettysburg. So Gettysburg was in the summer of 1863. By that November, they set up a ceremony to dedicate a cemetery for the soldiers that died at Gettysburg. And Lincoln is going to come and dedicate the cemetery. He's going to give a speech. It ends up being a very short speech known as the Gettysburg Address. This is a collection of people there to see the speakers that day. And if you notice, that's Lincoln sitting down in his chair right after he gave the speech. So, why this is so important is Lincoln surprises a lot of people with this speech. For one, how short it is, but what more importantly, what he says. He starts off by saying why they're there that day to dedicate the cemetery for the men that died at the Battle of Gettysburg. But he ends his speech on basically touching on the true meaning of the war and what it was all about. And why I want you to read it is because it's going to touch on these themes that we've talked about. What sort of a country are we? A union of uh, a united people or a collection of states? How are we doing on the idea of all men are created equal? Is that a principle we should live up to? How do we live up to that principle? He's going to touch on all of these themes that we've been talking about. So that is going to be your assignment for the second part of e-learning day. So you have to take a look at that. You will read the document and have a few questions with that.